For thousands of years, we stared at the stars and asked the same question. Are we alone? We sent out signals, little messages in a bottle tossed into a cosmic ocean, hoping for a reply. We built massive telescopes, straining our eyes to see any sign of life in the endless dark. We found nothing. But then, something found us. Way out in the freezing void beyond Neptune, space itself began to tear open. A glowing purple wound ripped through the fabric of reality. Then another, and another, until thousands of these scars bled light into the emptiness. And through those tears, the ships came. They were colossal, each one a kilometer of polished black metal, moving with a terrifying, silent grace. Their hulls were covered in weapons that pulsed with deadly energy. These weren't friendly visitors. They were conquerors. The Varath Dominion had arrived. On the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Conquest, High Commander Varath Kul watched the tiny blue planet grow larger on his screen. He was a giant of a creature, with skin like gray stone and 4 glowing orange eyes that glittered with cold amusement. His armor wasn't just metal. It was made from the bones of every species he had ever exterminated, a trophy case he wore into battle. Every bone was a reminder of a world that had been crushed into dust. He looked at the little blue marble on his screen. Earth. What a simple name for such a simple world. His spies had studied these humans for 6 months, learning their primitive languages and mapping their pathetic cities. He knew all about their weapons, nuclear bombs, jets, tanks. Vorath had actually laughed when he read the reports. His ships could fly through the heart of a star. His soldiers wore armor that could deflect an asteroid. These humans were like children playing with mud pies while his empire spanned 1,000 galaxies. "Torinth, give me the latest count," Vorath said to his second-in-command, a warrior covered in battle scars. "How many worlds have we conquered?" 247, High Commander, Torinth's deep voice rumbled. "Earth will make it 248. A tiny number," Vorath said, bored. "But the planet has good resources. We'll strip it bare and put the survivors to work in the mines." The fleet was massive, 9,900 ships in total. It was the biggest invasion force the Dominion had ever assembled for such a weak target. Usually, 100 ships would be more than enough, but Vorath had survived 300 years of constant war by never taking chances. Plus, his new soldiers needed some practice. A lot of them were fresh out of training and had never seen a real fight. Earth would be the perfect place for them to get their hands dirty. Let them learn how to kill here so they'd be ready for the real wars later. "Open a channel," Vorath ordered. "Broadcast on every frequency, in every one of their languages." His officer obeyed, sending a message hurtling toward Earth, the same cold, final ultimatum that 2,000 other worlds had heard right before they died. "People of Earth, I am High Commander Vorath of the Varath Dominion. Your world now belongs to us. Surrender your weapons, surrender your leaders, do exactly as we say. If you obey, you will live as our servants. If you resist, we will wipe you from existence. You have 1 day to decide. This is your only warning." 7 hours later, the message slammed into Earth. It took over every TV station, every radio frequency, every military command center. Within minutes, every government on the planet knew the end was here. At the United Nations, world leaders gathered in a desperate, panicked meeting. They stared at the screens showing the alien fleet, a swarm of death getting closer every second. "We have to surrender," the French representative said, his voice shaking. "Look at them. We can't fight that. We can't even put a dent in them." "Surrender is just a nice word for slavery," the American president snapped back. Her name was Sarah Chen. She was a former Marine who had lost her husband in a war 20 years ago. Her face was calm, but her eyes were on fire. "I was not elected to hand over the human race to a bunch of cosmic tyrants." "And what's your plan, Madam President?" the Russian leader shot back. "Our nukes are like bottle rockets against ships like those. Our armies might as well be throwing stones." A small, dangerous smile touched President Chen's lips. "Let me tell you a story," she said. 70 years ago, something crashed in the desert in New Mexico. Something that wasn't made on Earth. Our government found it. Our scientists took it apart. and our engineers have been very, very busy ever since. She touched her tablet, and the main screen lit up, showing blueprints for weapons and starships, technology that shouldn't exist. We called it Project Lazarus, Chen said, and every major country in this room has its own version of it. We've been preparing for this day for generations. We never knew if they'd come in peace or for war, so we prepared for war. You could have heard a pin drop in that room. Leaders who were seconds away from surrendering were now sitting straight up in their chairs. A tiny spark of hope had just been lit in the darkest hour. "Show us," the Chinese president said, his voice urgent. "Show us what we've got." Chen nodded to a general standing by the door, an old scarred soldier with the sharp eyes of a wolf. "The name's General Marcus Stone," he said, his voice rough like gravel. "I've been in charge of Project Lazarus for 30 years. Everything you think you know about our military is a lie. Let me show you the truth." For the next 2 hours, he revealed everything. The railgun cannons powered by fusion reactors hidden on the dark side of the moon. The secret fleet of 62 warships built in huge caverns underground and at the bottom of the ocean, a mix of human engineering and alien tech. He told them about the Shiva missiles, weapons that didn't just explode, they created tiny black holes that swallowed everything they touched. "We have 12,000 of them," Stone said, his face grim. "Enough to put out a sun." "Why weren't we told about this?" the British Prime Minister demanded. "We've been fighting over borders and oil while you were holding the fate of the world in your hands." "Because the only way to keep a secret that big," President Chen interrupted, "is to make sure almost nobody knows it exists. Every nation here has its own Lazarus project. We've been sharing information in secret, coordinating our hidden defenses for decades, but never speaking about it out loud. We always had a feeling someone might be listening." She looked up, as if she could see right through the ceiling to the stars. "And we were right. They've been spying on us for 6 months. They think we're weak. They think we're divided. They think we're an easy target." That dangerous smile came back. They're about to find out how wrong they are. Millions of miles away, Vorath was getting annoyed. It had been 20 hours since he sent his ultimatum. The humans hadn't responded. "Maybe their technology is too primitive to send a reply," Torrance suggested, "or they didn't understand." "They have radio," Vorath snapped. "They've been blasting their terrible music into space for a century. They can answer. They're choosing not to." This was new. Every other species had replied immediately, either begging for mercy or trying to negotiate, but the humans were just silent. "What in the 7 hells are they doing down there?" he muttered. He ordered his scout ships to fly in closer. The reports he got back only made him more confused. "High Commander, they're going dark," a pilot said over the comms. "Their satellites are shutting down. Global communications are offline. It's like they're trying to hide from us." Vorath let out a harsh laugh. "Hide from me? There's nowhere on that mudball they can hide." But as his laughter faded, a tiny splinter of doubt pricked him. In 300 years of conquest, he'd seen everything. He'd seen races fight to the last man. He'd seen them run. He'd seen them grovel. But he had never, ever seen a species just go quiet. Down on Earth, the final moves were being made. The Lazarus protocols were now active all over the world. Soldiers who had spent their entire lives training for a war that was never supposed to happen were moving to their positions. Weapons that technically didn't exist were being aimed at the sky. In a farmhouse in Montana, a 60-year-old farmer named Jack Wilson was watching the news. With hands as tough as leather and a face lined by the sun, he thought his fighting days were over. Then his phone buzzed. A voice on the other end said a simple code phrase he had memorized 40 years ago but never expected to hear. "Lazarus is rising," the voice said. "Report to Station 7. Jack turned off the TV. He walked out to the old barn and over to the rusty tractor in the corner. He reached under the seat and pulled out a key he had carried with him every day for 4 decades. Behind the barn, hidden under a slab of concrete buried beneath years of dirt and grass, was a steel hatch. Jack's key opened it. An elevator inside took him deep, deep underground. 15 minutes later, the doors slid open into a massive secret base, humming with energy. Hundreds of soldiers were already there, prepping gear that looked like it was from the future, glowing weapons that buzzed with power. A young officer saw him and did a double-take. "Sergeant Wilson, sir, I thought you retired." "I made a promise, and I'm damn well keeping it," James grumbled, his voice like gravel over the comms link. He looked around at the other soldiers packed into the command center, their faces lit by the ghostly blue glow of tactical displays. Some were fresh-faced kids, barely old enough to vote, their eyes a mix of terror and steely resolve. Others were old-timers like him, their faces a roadmap of forgotten wars. But they all had the same look in their eyes, not fear, but a cold, quiet anger. "So what's the play?" James asked the officer on the main screen. "We wait," the voice crackled back. "We let them get comfortable, real close, then we open up with everything we've got, and we don't stop until they're dust, or we are." James nodded slowly. He could work with that. Simple was good. "Sounds like a plan," he said. "Count me in." Far above, the silent stars watched as the enemy fleet approached, a wave of death about to crash on a world that was waiting, coiled and ready to bite back. On the bridge of his capital ship, High Commander Varathkal made his decision as his fleet tore past the orbit of Mars. "I've had enough of this waiting game," he announced to his command crew. "Deploy the Vanguard, 400 ships. Their orders are to smash their military centers and flatten their biggest cities. It's time we taught these upstarts the cost of defiance." His second-in-command, Torinth, shifted on his feet. "Sir, their total radio silence is strange. Maybe we should send in a recon drone first, just to see what we're walking into?" Varathkal dismissed him with a flick of his hand. "I have conquered 2,000 worlds, Torinth. I don't need to see what these primitives have. I just need to break their will. Launch the Vanguard, now." Just as he ordered, 400 of the deadliest ships in his fleet broke off from the main formation, rocketing toward the little blue planet. They were the fastest things he had, armed with plasma cannons that could melt mountains and carrying thousands of warriors hungry for a fight. They screamed past the moon's orbit at exactly 0347 Greenwich Mean Time. At 0348, the moon shot first. The first weapon was a 50-meter tungsten rod, a giant metal telephone pole fired from a hidden cannon at 8% of the speed of light. Moving that fast, it hit with more kinetic force than any nuke humanity had ever dreamed of. It slammed into the lead alien ship before the crew even knew they were under attack. The ship didn't explode. It just evaporated. 1 second it was there, a marvel of engineering. The next, it was an expanding puff of superheated gas. A second later, more slugs came. 10, then 20, then 50, then 100. They erupted from what looked like dead craters, from silent mountain ranges, and from secret bases the world's governments had sworn for decades didn't exist. 12 of Varathkal's ships simply ceased to exist in the first 3 seconds. On the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Conquest, every alarm began to scream. "What in the blazes is going on?" Varathkal bellowed. "Report now!" Torinth's eyes were as wide as dinner plates. "It's their moon! They've weaponized their entire moon! Those are railguns, High Commander, firing slugs at .08 light speed! Our shields can't—" He was cut off by an even louder alarm. From the surface of Earth itself, thousands of missiles were climbing to meet them. But these weren't the clumsy rockets the invaders expected. These things moved. Wrong. They seemed to shimmer in and out of sight, zigzagging in ways that completely broke the targeting computers. "I can't get a lock," a weapons officer screamed. "It's like they're bending space. Our sensors can't track them." The ghostly missiles hit the Vanguard and started to pop. But there was no fire, no explosion. Instead, they blossomed with pure darkness. At the point of impact, a tiny ball of absolute nothing appeared for a split second. In that single instant, it ate everything it touched: ships, energy shields, armor, and the poor souls inside. Nothing survived. Vorathkul watched in pure shock as his elite vanguard was torn to pieces. Ships that had survived legendary campaigns against entire star empires were being erased like chalk drawings in the rain. Crews that had conquered planets were dying before they even knew what was hitting them. "That's impossible," he stammered, his voice shaking. "Those weapons, they're singularities, tiny man-made black holes." "That kind of tech shouldn't even exist," Torrance whispered next to him. "Even our top scientists haven't figured that out." But the humans had. For 70 years they had worked in secret labs buried under mountains and hidden beneath the crushing depths of the sea. They'd failed 1,000 times. They'd accidentally wiped entire research teams from existence in horrific accidents. But they never gave up. They kept pushing, kept learning, and kept building. And now, they were finally unleashing their terrible new toys on the enemy who had come to enslave them. 90 minutes after the moon opened fire, the vanguard was gone. Of the 400 ships that had so confidently charged in, less than 200 limped away, their crews screaming warnings over the comms that sounded like mad ravings. Vorathkul sank into his command chair, all four of his eyes wide with a kind of shock he'd never felt before. In 300 years of conquest, he had never lost a battle. In 300 years, he had never been caught off guard. In a single night, these humans had managed to do both. Torrance approached him slowly. "Hi, Commander. What are your orders?" Vorathkul was quiet for a long, heavy moment. He thought about retreating. He thought about being cautious. He thought about every lesson he'd ever learned in war. And then he thought about the Dominion Council back home and what they did to commanders who came back in defeat after being beaten by a species they had dismissed as primitives. His face hardened, the shock replaced by pure fury. "All ships," he said, his voice cold as the void. "Full-scale assault. Every gun, every soldier. We will crush them with sheer numbers. We will bury them in fire." He stood up, his hands clenched into fists. "I don't care how many ships we lose. I don't care how many of our own die," he snarled. "We will burn this world until nothing is left but dust and echoes." The order ripped through the fleet. 9,000 warships began their grim march toward Earth, their weapons glowing hot, their crews bracing for the fight of their lives. They had no idea they were flying straight into a meat grinder. They had no idea that most of them would never see home again. They had no idea they had just picked a fight with a species that would rather burn their own planet to a cinder than ever bend the knee. And down on the surface of the moon, an old soldier named Captain James Morrison watched the enemy fleet fill his screens and let out a grim, tight smile. His railguns were humming, his crews were ready, and the enemy was walking right into his trap. "You wanted a war," he muttered to the darkness of the command center. "Congratulations, you got one. Now let's see who's willing to bleed more." He slammed his fist down on a large red button, and the moon's cannons began to sing their terrible song once again. The real war for Earth had begun. The space around the planet was already a graveyard. Twisted pieces of metal that used to be warships tumbled through the blackness. Bodies, frozen solid in the vacuum, drifted silently through the wreckage. Inside shattered hulls, fires still burned where pockets of air remained. It looked like a nightmare, and it was just getting started. High Commander Vorathkul stood on his bridge watching his colossal fleet descend. 9,000 warships, a tidal wave of steel and fury, moving in perfect, deadly sync. The burning wreckage of his vanguard fleet behind them was a stark reminder of the fight to come. "Give me a full report," Vorathkul ordered. "The moon's defenses are still active," Torrance said, his voice tight. "They've already knocked out another 60 ships as we approached. Our shields are barely holding against those slugs. We're having to divert nearly all power to keep them up." "We won't need them for long," Vorathkul snapped. "Order the assault carriers to begin landing. I want our troops on the ground. Let's see how these humans fight when we're standing right in front of them." He smiled, showing a row of sharp, predatory teeth. On the ground, his warriors were gods. No secret space weapon was going to save the humans from millions of Vareth shock troopers in advanced battle armor. The huge assault carriers broke away from the fleet and dove into the atmosphere. Each one was a flying city, carrying 10,000 soldiers and hundreds of war machines. Their armor was built to survive orbital bombardment, their shields designed to stop any weapon the humans had shown them so far. Or so the Varath thought. In a bunker buried miles beneath Washington, D.C., President Sarah Chen watched the enemy's approach on a wall of screens. "They're making landfall," General Stone said, his voice a low growl. 12 carriers are touching down in North America alone. We're seeing more across Europe, Asia, and Africa. They're trying to hit us on all fronts at once. "Then we'll face them everywhere at once," President Chen declared, her voice as quiet and as cold as deep space. "Activate every Lazarus unit on the ground." And General, "Yes, Madam President," he responded. "Authorize Protocol Chimera. Let our people know the rulebook has been thrown out. No holds barred. Whatever it takes." Stone nodded sharply. He understood perfectly. The secret weapons they had developed were nightmares, some built to fight off world threats, others for human wars so horrifying no one had ever dared to start one. Until today. "May God have mercy on us," Stone whispered. "God helps those who help themselves, General," the President countered, her gaze fixed on the main screen. "So let's start helping." The first Varath dropship landed in the Nevada desert, near the melted glass that used to be Las Vegas. The city was already a ghost, wiped out in the first wave of attacks, its famous glowing strip now nothing but a scar of ash and ruins. To the Varath, it was the ideal staging ground, flat, wide open, and perfect for deploying their armies. They never imagined that the desert itself was lying in wait, ready to swallow them whole. Commander Rexith was the first to stomp down the ramp. He was young for a Varath officer, only 80 years old, and his armor was spotless, having never seen the heat of a real battle. He was hungry for his first taste of glory. "Spread out!" he bellowed at his soldiers. "Set a perimeter. At sunrise, we march on the nearest human town." His soldiers moved with the flawless, practiced precision of a veteran army, weapons at the ready, helmet sensors scanning the silent wasteland. They detected nothing. The desert was completely still. Only sand, rocks, and the skeletal remains of old buildings. Rexith sneered. Where were the humans? Did they flee? Were these primitives so cowardly they wouldn't even put up a fight? Just then, the entire desert floor blew up. It was mines, thousands of them, buried just an inch beneath the sand. But these were no ordinary explosives. They unleashed focused blasts of plasma, crippling electromagnetic shockwaves, and concentrated beams of light that sliced through Varath armor like it was made of paper. In the first few seconds, hundreds of his soldiers were simply erased from existence. Screams and a blizzard of static clogged the comm channels as soldiers collapsed and didn't get back up. "It's an ambush!" Rexith roared into his helmet. "Find cover! Return fire!" But there was nothing to shoot at. The mines were all automated, triggered by motion and heat signatures. The humans who had planted them were miles away in reinforced bunkers, watching the whole massacre unfold on video screens. Next came the drones. They were tiny, about the size of a hummingbird, and they appeared in a swarm of thousands, zipping around so fast our sensors could barely track them. Each one carried only a few grams of high explosive wrapped around a metal pellet. On its own, it was a firecracker. But together, they were a hurricane of death that crashed into the Varath ranks. They shot into the small gaps of their armor, flew directly into ventilation ports, and slipped into the soft flesh between a helmet and a soldier's neck. They went off in tiny, controlled explosions of fire and shrapnel, killing not with overwhelming force, but with the precision of a surgeon's knife. Rexith could only watch as his army was systematically dismantled. He had landed with 2,000 troops. Not even 10 minutes later, more than half of them were dead. The survivors were pinned down, hiding behind anything they could find, firing wildly at an enemy they couldn't even see. "I need orbital support now," Rexith screamed. "We need a bombardment. We need—" A single drone flew straight into his open mouth. He never finished his request. Across the planet, the same horror story was playing out. The Varath had come expecting an easy victory. What they got was a world-sized death trap. In Germany, human soldiers wearing advanced exoskeletons ambushed a landing party deep in the Black Forest. They moved like phantoms between the ancient trees, appearing from thin air to fire one perfectly aimed, devastating shot before vanishing back into the gloom. The Vareth couldn't catch them. They couldn't even get a lock on them. Every time they thought they had an enemy soldier cornered, they were already gone. In China, the invasion force touched down in the Gobi Desert and was met by 1 million human soldiers waiting for them in fortified trenches. But these weren't just walls of concrete and steel. They were constructed from smart materials that could repair themselves, constantly shifting and reshaping to absorb or deflect enemy fire. The Vareth threw everything they had at the walls, and the walls simply held. Down in Brazil, the Amazon rainforest itself seemed to come alive, a sprawling jungle filled with deadly traps and hidden ambushes. Trees were rigged to explode if you got too close. The rivers were laced with a chemical agent that ate through Vareth armor on contact. Even the animals were turned into weapons, fitted with tiny cameras and explosive charges, transforming the entire jungle into a living, breathing minefield. And it didn't matter where the Vareth landed. The human soldiers fought with a level of ferocity that was completely beyond their comprehension. On the bridge of the flagship, the Eternal Conquest, High Commander Vorethal watched the casualty reports stream in. His face was like a mask carved from stone, showing no emotion. But inside, his mind was reeling. "Impossible," he muttered to himself. "This is utterly impossible." "We've lost 200,000 soldiers on the first day," his second-in-command Torrent reported, his voice shaking. "Ground Commander Rexith is confirmed dead. So are Commanders Yexath, Belor, Seneth, and 47 other ranking officers. Our ground forces are pleading for immediate evacuation." "Denied," Vorethal said without hesitation. "They will hold their positions. Send down the reinforcements." "High Commander, if we send more troops down there, they will just be slaughtered. The humans have made their entire planet a weapon. Every forest, every desert, every city is a kill box. We can't fight an enemy that we can't even find." "Then we will burn their hiding places to ash," Vorethal snarled. "We will turn their deserts into glass. We will flatten every city until there is nowhere left for them to run." He spun around to face his weapons officer. "Begin orbital bombardment. Maximum yield. I want that entire planet scoured clean." The weapons officer hesitated. "High Commander, our directive from the Council was to secure the planet intact." "The Council is not here," Vorethal snapped back. "I am, and I am giving you the order to burn it all." The command was sent. Across the entire invasion fleet, enormous plasma cannons began to whine as they powered up. Targeting systems locked onto cities, forests, and oceans. The Vareth were about to erase Earth from the history books. But the humans had one final surprise waiting. Deep inside a command bunker buried under the Rocky Mountains, built to survive a global thermonuclear war, Admiral Chen Wei watched the enemy fleet prepare to fire. She was the commander of Earth's secret space force, a fleet of 62 warships constructed in absolute secrecy over the past 40 years. She was also President Chen's younger sister. "They're charging their main weapons," her tactical officer reported. "We estimate 2 minutes until they fire." "Then we have 2 minutes to show them what hell really looks like," Chen Wei answered calmly. "Order all ships to launch, full speed, engage attack pattern Omega." "Admiral, our forces are outnumbered 150 to 1. If we engage them head-on, we'll be wiped out." "And if we do nothing," she replied, rising from her command chair, "Earth will be." She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, but she carried herself with the authority of a giant. "I didn't spend my life building this fleet just to hide in a hole while my world burns. Launch the ships." "Yes, Admiral." All over the planet, hidden doors rumbled open. From deep within the mountains of Colorado, from the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, and from the frozen plains of Antarctica, a fleet of warships began to ascend. They were colored pitch black, shaped like arrowheads, and coated in a stealth material that Vareth sensors couldn't even detect, They were powered by gravity drives, a technology humans had secretly reverse-engineered from that one alien ship that crashed in New Mexico so long ago. They moved without rockets, without exhaust, and without making a sound. They simply rose into the sky, accelerating faster than anything humanity had ever created. In 3 minutes, they were in orbit. In 4 minutes, they were ripping the enemy fleet to shreds. The Vareth had no idea what hit them. Admiral Chen Wei's flagship, the UES Defiance, fired the opening shot. A focused beam of gravitational force slammed into a Vareth cruiser and crushed it like a soda can. The gigantic warship just folded in on itself, its shields and armor completely useless against a weapon that attacked space itself. "All ships, engage," Chen Wei commanded. "Target their weapon systems first. Do not allow them to fire on Earth." The human fleet tore through the Vareth armada like a pack of wolves set loose in a field of sheep. They were smaller, faster, and infinitely more maneuverable than the clumsy enemy ships. They weaved in between the colossal Vareth battleships, getting right up close to fire at point-blank range where their shields were the weakest. The Vareth desperately tried to fight back, filling the darkness of space with plasma fire and waves of missiles. But the human ships were practically impossible to hit. They dodged and twisted, using their gravity drives to perform maneuvers that seemed to break the laws of physics. Shots that should have been direct hits missed by feet, then by inches, as human pilots pushed their experimental ships to the absolute limit. They thought we were an easy target, a primitive little world ripe for the picking. High Commander Vorthel sneered at the blue marble on his screen, a conqueror already tasting victory. But he made one fatal mistake. He underestimated us. What you're about to hear is the story of how a handful of heroes, outgunned and outnumbered, stared into the abyss and spat in its eye. And trust me, you'll want to see how it ends. Even when the aliens, the Vareth, scored a direct hit, things didn't go their way. Lieutenant Sarah Okonkwo, just 26 years old and a lifetime away from her home in Lagos, was behind the controls of a tiny fighter she called the Scorpion. She'd been training for this since she was 18, dreaming of protecting her family. A massive Vareth destroyer locked on, unleashing a torrent of plasma. Her shields vaporized instantly. Alarms screamed as her ship began to cook. "Shields are toast," she said, her voice impossibly calm. "Hull's at 40%, but my guns are still hot." "Get out of there, Scorpion," her commander yelled. "Negative," she replied, flooring it. "I'm taking their command ship with me." The Vareth crew watched in disbelief as the smoking, burning little ship charged straight at them. They tried to maneuver their behemoth out of the way, but it was like trying to dodge a bullet. Sarah lined up her shot, aiming right for the destroyer's glowing engines. At the last possible second, she unleashed her entire payload, 4 graviton missiles, each with enough punch to splinter a small moon. Then she wrenched the controls up, the Scorpion's frame screaming in protest as she flew directly through the blossoming fireball of the destroyer's exploding core. She somehow made it out the other side, her ship a mangled piece of scrap, but she was alive. "Target's gone," she gasped. "The Scorpion's a wreck, but I'm ready for another." That same insane courage was happening all over the battlefield. Human pilots fought with a ferocity the Vareth had never encountered. When their ships got hit, they didn't run, they charged harder. When their missiles ran dry, they turned their ships into battering rams. And when they had nothing left, they'd eject and take potshots with their sidearms at enemy bridges as they floated by. It was absolute madness. It was suicide. And it was working. "They're not giving up," Second-in-Command Torrens said, a strange respect in his voice. "We destroy one and 2 more take its place." "What kind of species is this?" High Commander Vorthel growled. "A species of fools," he answered himself. But for the first time, he wasn't so sure. The battle raged for hours. The human fleet was getting torn apart, their numbers dwindling with every fiery explosion. But for every single human ship they lost, they took a dozen Vareth ships with them. The cold, hard math of war was starting to turn against the invaders in a way Vorthel had never seen. By the end of that first day, humanity had lost 38 ships. Only 24 remained, all of them battered and running on fumes. But the Vareth fleet had lost 800 ships. Vorthul stared at the numbers, and a feeling he hadn't experienced in centuries crept into his heart. It was fear. "We must withdraw, High Commander," Torin pleaded. "We need to regroup. Our forces are in disarray." "And give them time to rearm, to build more of those insane weapons?" Vorthul slammed his fist on the console. "No, we press the attack. We will grind their pathetic little fleet into dust." His subordinate looked at him. "Sir, with all due respect, I've been studying them. They won't break. They aren't fighting for territory or glory. They're fighting because they refuse to die. They would rather be turned to atoms than surrender." Vorthul sneered. "Then we will grant their wish." "Yes," the officer said quietly. "But how many of us will they take with them?" Back on Earth, President Chen read the grim report. 38 ships, thousands of brave souls gone. But the enemy's bombardment of the planet had stopped for now. "How much time did they buy us?" she asked General Stone, her voice thick with grief. "Days," he replied, his face a mask of exhaustion. "Maybe a week, if a miracle happens. But we're almost out of our Shiva missiles. Once those are gone, we're throwing rocks." Chen closed her eyes, fighting back a wave of despair. She knew they couldn't win, not really, but she also knew her people would fight anyway. It's just what humans do. "Keep fighting," she ordered, her voice like steel. "Make them pay for every inch of our world in blood." On the screen, she saw her sister's flagship, the Defiance. It was scarred and broken, but it was still flying. A small, fierce smile touched her lips. "Give 'em hell, little sister," she whispered. "Make them remember us." The Vareth had come expecting to swat a fly. They were just now realizing they had kicked a hornet's nest. In the silent darkness, both sides tended to their wounds. The Vareth called in thousands of fresh ships from their reserve fleet. The humans used duct tape and prayers to patch their 24 remaining fighters, rearming every last gun they had. No one knew who would be left standing. The second day began with hellfire. Every ship, every gun, every soldier, High Commander Vorthul commanded. "We will drown this world in its own blood." He pointed a clawed finger at the beautiful blue planet. "Target their cities. I want their people to scream. I want them to know that hope is dead." 9,000 Vareth ships surged forward, a tidal wave of destruction. The moon's defense cannons fired relentlessly, but it was like throwing pebbles at an avalanche. And rising to meet them were the last 24 ships of the human fleet. It wasn't a battle. It was a final, glorious stand. Admiral Chen Wei, aboard the Defiance, knew it was a suicide mission. So did her crew. They flew out anyway. "All ships," she ordered, her voice as steady as a mountain, "target their troop carriers. If we're going down, we're taking as many of them with us as we can." The Defiance led the charge, its hull a mess of patchwork repairs. Half its weapons were fried. Its shields were barely there. None of it mattered. "Fire," Chen Wei said. A beam of pure gravity erupted from the ship, crushing a Vareth carrier like a soda can. And then, a small surprise for the invaders. The missile pods opened, launching the last of their Shiva missiles. But these weren't ordinary explosives. This was humanity's miracle, the big reveal. As the missiles neared the Vareth fleet, they didn't explode. They burst open, releasing a shimmering, invisible cloud. A nanite swarm. Billions of microscopic machines programmed with one mission: devour Vareth technology. The swarm washed over the enemy fleet, and suddenly the Vareth ships began to turn on each other. Cannons fired without orders, engines overloaded, life support systems failed. The mighty Vareth fleet was tearing itself apart from the inside out. Their own advanced technology had become their doom. The first human ship to fall that day, the Spirit of Tokyo, took 300 enemy ships with it as its captain. Hiroshi Tanaka rammed his exploding vessel into a carrier. But it was the last loss they'd suffer. The Vareth fleet collapsed into chaos. On the bridge of his dying flagship, Vorthul saw the tiny Defiance appear on his screen. Admiral Chen Wei looked at him, not with hatred, but with a cold pity. "You should have left us alone," she said, just before his screen went dark. Earth was saved. The victory came at a terrible cost, but it came with a lesson for the entire galaxy. Never mistake desperation for weakness. Humans may be small, but they will never, ever go quietly into the night. First, the pride of Nigeria went dark, then the Moscow's fury, then the Amazon dawn. One after another, the beacons of humanity's last defense vanished. Their crews fought to the bitter end, guns blazing, never surrendering. From her command chair, Admiral Chen Wei watched her fleet get ripped apart around her. She knew this was coming. She'd accepted it. But knowing something and seeing it happen are two entirely different things. Admiral, her tactical officer's voice was tight with stress. We're down 12 ships. We only have 12 left. There's no way we can win this. We can and we will, Chen Wei snapped back. Every second we keep them busy up here is a second they're not burning our cities to ash. Every minute we buy is another 1,000,000 lives saved. She looked at her communications officer. Open a channel to every last ship. Her voice was a steel blade. Tell them how proud I am, that no matter what happens today, we've already won. The enemy showed up expecting to find sheep, but we've shown them that humans aren't sheep. We're wolves. That message shot through the fleet. On every bridge, exhausted crews heard their admiral's words and felt a fire ignite in their chests. All ships, Chen Wei ordered, her gaze fixed on the colossal enemy flagship. Form on me. We're taking the fight to their front door. If this is our last day, we're taking their commander with us. The 12 remaining ships, battered and trailing fire, closed ranks around the Defiance. They were barely holding together, but they formed a perfect spearhead and aimed themselves for one final desperate charge at the enemy command ship, the Eternal Conquest. From his throne, Commander Vor saw them coming. He'd been watching these ridiculous humans fight for hours, and he felt something he hadn't experienced in centuries. A flicker of respect. They were total madmen, but they were the most courageous madmen he'd ever seen. They're heading right for us, his second-in-command pointed out, stating the obvious. 12 ships against our whole fleet. This is suicide. Oh, they know, Vor said, a weird tone in his voice. They just don't care. Order all ships to concentrate fire. Let's end this little drama before it gets boring. The entire Varath armada pivoted its cannons toward the 12 human ships. Thousands of weapons fired at once, creating a hellstorm of plasma and light right in their path. The European unity was the first to evaporate. Then the Cairo Star. Then the Sol Phoenix. Chen Wei didn't even flinch as she watched her ships disintegrate, just kept flying straight ahead. 8 ships left. 7. 6. Admiral, we're not going to make it, her pilot choked out, his knuckles bone-white on the controls. There are too many of them. Then we'll die trying, Chen Wei said, her voice eerily calm. Maximum speed. All remaining weapons, open fire. The Defiance bucked and screamed as enemy fire tore through its hull. Fires broke out on every deck. The lights went out. Alarms shrieked from every speaker. 4 ships left. 3, 2, and then it was just the Defiance flying alone. All other friendlies are gone, Admiral, the tactical officer said. Her voice was strangely calm. She had made her peace with it. They all had. Distance to the enemy flagship? Chen Wei asked. 50 kilometers in closing, was the answer. It was too far, way too far. The Defiance was being torn to shreds. It was never going to reach the Eternal Conquest. Their final glorious charge had failed. At least, that's what it looked like. A cold, chilling smile spread across Chen Wei's lips. It was the smile of someone holding one last terrifying ace up her sleeve. Helm, new target, she ordered. Bring us around to that cluster of troop carriers on our right. Ma'am, you heard me. Do it. The Defiance groaned as it veered away from the flagship, now hurtling toward a thick formation of Varath ships carrying invasion troops to Earth. Those were the ground troops meant to finish the job. Arm the self-destruct sequence, Chen Wei commanded. Set it for maximum yield. Her first officer stared at her, and you could see the understanding click in his eyes. Admiral, if we detonate our reactor right in the middle of them, I know exactly what will happen, she cut him off. Set the sequence. Yes, ma'am. The Defiance dove into the swarm of carriers like a bolt of lightning from God. The Vera threw everything they had at it, but the ship was moving too fast, too erratically. It was a ghost ship on its final flight, and nothing could stop it. Chen Wei rose from her command chair. She looked at her bridge crew, the brave people who had become her family. They looked back, their faces filled with pride, not fear. "It has been an honor," she said, her voice heavy with emotion. "The honor was all ours, Admiral," her first officer replied for everyone. The Defiance plunged into the heart of the carrier fleet, and then Admiral Chen Wei gave her last order: for Earth. The ship's core went critical, unleashing a contained singularity that didn't just explode. It tore a hole in reality. It swallowed the closest troop carriers, whose own reactors went critical, feeding the black hole, pulling in dozens, then hundreds of Vareth ships, including the distant, horrified flagship. For one brilliant moment, a new star burned in the sky above Earth, a star made of pure defiance. And then there was only silence, and a gaping wound in the Vareth armada. The invasion was broken. The planet was saved. President Chen stood in the command bunker, her face like a statue, but inside, her world was crumbling. The report was brutal. Her own sister, Admiral Chen Wei, had just detonated her flagship, sacrificing the entire human fleet in one last desperate gamble. The explosion was biblical, wiping out 12 enemy carriers and crippling 20 more, taking almost 1,000 alien ships with them. 50,000 Vareth soldiers vaporized in an instant. But it wasn't enough. Our fleet was gone, and now nothing stood between the Vareth armada and Earth. It was an unprovoked attack, an attempt to wipe us out, and we were the ultimate underdogs facing total extinction. But what the aliens didn't know was that our most powerful weapons were never in space. Stick around to see how humanity snatches victory from the jaws of defeat. When the officer finished the report, the president gave herself one silent second. Her sister was gone, the last family she had. But grief was a luxury she couldn't afford. She was the president of Earth, and she had a planet to save. "General Stone, give me a status report," she said, her voice solid as a rock. 3 million have already landed, ma'am, and more are on the way. They're crushing our defenses in North America and Europe." He paused. "And our other assets? The doomsday weapons we swore we'd never use?" The general's face was grim. "Madam President, if we unleash those, the civilian casualties will be astronomical. We're talking about millions of our own people caught in the crossfire." He didn't need to say the alternative. They both knew what would happen if the Vareth won. "Use them," President Chen ordered, her voice as cold as deep space. "And may God have mercy on our souls." "Yes, Madam President." The weapons she was talking about were humanity's darkest secrets, terrifying things we had built and then prayed we would never have to turn on. We're talking about bombs designed to unleash plagues that only targeted Vareth DNA, machines that could trigger massive earthquakes under enemy armies, and orbital platforms that could focus the sun's rays into a beam that could melt a city. These were weapons of absolute last resort, and the kill switch was about to be flipped. Miles away in the Nevada desert, Commander Zareth, a Vareth officer, was cruising in his command tank, oozing with arrogance. His force was unstoppable, 50,000 soldiers and 200 vehicles rolling toward the ruins of Los Angeles. The humans had scattered before him like ants. Victory was certain. And then the sky itself seemed to catch fire. Zareth looked up, confused. The sun, it looked like it was growing, focusing into a single, blinding point of light. A beam of pure, shimmering heat shot down from the heavens and slammed into the middle of his tank column. The temperature flash-boiled past anything their advanced armor could withstand. Tanks melted into glowing pools of liquid metal. Soldiers were instantly cooked inside their own battlesuits. The desert sand beneath them turned into a massive sheet of black glass. Zareth's tank was at the edge of the beam and he barely managed to drag himself out, half his body scorched black. Lying on the smoldering ground, watching his invincible army literally melt away, he could only whisper, "What? What is this?" He would never find out. A kilometer away, a human sniper hidden in the rubble put a round right through the alien commander's head. And that was just the start. All over the world, the Varith were walking into one nightmare after another. In Moscow, their occupying army suddenly began choking, coughing up their own lungs as a bioengineered plague tore through their ranks. 50,000 of them were dead within hours. In Japan, the ground underneath a major Varith base started to shake violently. Our earthquake machines, buried deep underground years ago, had been turned on, ripping open giant chasms that swallowed soldiers and tanks whole. And in Africa, swarms of nanobots, totally invisible to the naked eye, descended upon an entire Varith army. These microscopic machines were programmed for one purpose: to consume Varith biology and technology. They ate through armor like it was paper, then moved on to flesh and bone. An army of 100,000 soldiers was reduced to a field of clean skeletons in less than an hour. The Varith came prepared for nukes and missiles. They had no idea we had turned our whole planet into one giant horrific death trap. Aboard their command ship, High Commander Vorthal was losing his mind. What are they doing? What are these weapons? His scientists were panicking. High Commander, it appears the humans have been planning this for decades. These weapons are engineered specifically for us. The plague, the nanites, they target our unique genetic code. Even the earthquake generators, one analyst stammered. They were positioned exactly where our invasion models predicted we'd assemble. How could they have known? Vorthal demanded. The scientist just shook his head. They didn't. They put them everywhere. High Commander, their whole planet is one giant weapon. A chilling dread crept over Vorthal. He'd already lost over 1,000 ships and nearly 1 million ground troops, and they had barely managed to secure a single foothold. We should pull back, his second-in-command urged. Let's regroup, analyze these weapons, and return with a better strategy. No, Vorthal bellowed. We are in too deep. The Dominion Council will have our heads for this failure. He spun toward the communications officer, his eyes wide with a mix of fury and terror. Signal all ships to begin a full orbital bombardment. I want you to target everything, their cities, their weapon emplacements, their people. If they want a dirty fight, we'll show them what true filth is. Scorch their world until only ash remains. But, High Commander, our orders were to— The Council isn't here, Vorthal shrieked, his composure completely gone. I am, and I'm ordering you to burn this miserable planet to the ground. The command was sent. The last ships of the Varith fleet began to charge their primary cannons. But humanity had one final play. Hidden deep inside a secret bunker beneath the Colorado mountains, a weapon unlike anything ever conceived was powering on. It wasn't a bomb or a biological agent. It was something that simply tore up the rulebook of physics. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the mind behind Project Prometheus, had poured 30 years of her life into this device. It was a machine that could literally rip a hole in the very fabric of space and time. Is the facility secure? She asked her young assistant, Maria. Yes, Doctor. Everyone has been evacuated except for us. All right then, let's fire it up. Maria hesitated for a moment. Doctor, we've never run it at 100% power. We have no real idea what it's going to do. Rodriguez offered a small, sad smile. Oh, I have a very good idea of what it will do. We're about to create a wound in reality itself, a wound so deep it will pull every single enemy ship out of orbit and swallow it whole. And us along with it? Maria asked softly. And us along with it, Rodriguez confirmed. It requires manual control right up to the very end. There's just no other way. She looked at her assistant. Go on, Maria. Get out of here. I can handle the rest. The young woman stood up a little straighter. No, I'm staying. Someone has to watch the power levels. Besides, she added with a quiet finality, I don't have anyone waiting for me out there. This is as good a way to go as any. Rodriguez gave her a look of profound gratitude and then nodded. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Doctor. They both turned to their consoles and initiated the final sequence. High above them, searing bolts of plasma rained down from the heavens, melting entire cities and boiling the oceans. Millions of lives were snuffed out in an instant. But deep beneath the earth, two scientists watched their monitors, just waiting for the perfect moment. "The fleet is bunching up," Maria reported. "They're concentrating their fire on the east coast, directly above us." "Perfect," Rodriguez said, her fingers dancing across the keypad. "They've gathered together for their own execution. Do it, Maria, now." Maria slammed her hand down on the activation button. For one split second, absolute silence. Then, every alarm in the facility began to scream as the energy readings shot completely off the charts. The entire mountain groaned and shuddered around them. "It's working," Rodriguez whispered, her voice filled with awe. "It's actually working." Up in orbit, the Verith fleet was suddenly and violently wrenched sideways. Alarms blared across every bridge as the ships were pulled by an unseen, unstoppable force. Engines strained against it, threatening to tear themselves apart, but it was useless. One by one, the ships were dragged toward the center of their formation, where reality itself was unraveling. A hole of pure, silent blackness was opening in space. It wasn't a wormhole, it was an injury, a total absence of everything that consumed light, matter, and even time itself. "What is that thing?" High Commander Vorethel shrieked from his command chair as his own vessel began to creak and groan under the immense pressure. "It's unknown," his officer yelled back. "Our sensors can't get a reading. It's just eating the fleet." The hole expanded, triggering a chain reaction. The incredible energy released by the dying ships only fed the anomaly, making it stronger, bigger, and hungrier. It didn't just swallow 300 ships, it swallowed every last one of them. Vorethel's final moments were a piercing scream of pure terror as he watched the blackness fill his viewport, ripping his flagship apart atom by atom. Deep underground, Dr. Rodriguez and Maria were vaporized in the resulting energy backlash, their sacrifice saving billions of lives. On the surface, the remaining Verith soldiers stared up at the sky as their fleet, their entire mighty armada, simply vanished. They were stranded, without leaders, and utterly terrified. They had arrived as conquerors, expecting to steamroll a primitive world. Instead, they had kicked a hornet's nest the size of a planet. President Chen watched the after-action report on the main screen, her expression impossible to read. The war was over. Earth was scarred, bleeding, and mourning millions. But it was safe. We had won. The price was almost too high to bear, but the moral of the story was now burned into the stars for any other would-be invaders to read. You can back humanity into a corner, but you are not going to like what comes out. What do you do when you realize you can't win? If you're the alien invaders known as the Verith, you decide to just burn the entire planet to the ground. That was the impossible choice humanity was facing. The scars from this war would mark our world for generations. But we never gave up hope. From underground bunkers and hidden caves, from the skeletons of our cities and the ashes of our forests, we fought back. We would ambush their patrols, sabotage their equipment, and die by the thousands. But for every one of us they killed, we took 10 of them with us. The Verith showed up expecting an easy victory. What they found was a species that would rather go extinct than ever bend the knee. And their real nightmare was just beginning. Stick around to find out how we gave them a war they would never, ever forget. By the 4th day, High Commander Verith wasn't even trying to sleep anymore. He just stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Conquest, staring at the tactical maps with eyes that were hollowed out from pure exhaustion. The numbers flickering on those screens were telling a story his mind simply refused to believe. A story that defied every law of military logic. He had arrived at Earth with 9,900 warships. He was now down to fewer than 7,000. More than 3,000 ships, each one a masterpiece of Verith engineering, had been turned into space dust by a species that shouldn't have been able to scratch their paint. "We just lost another patrol in the southern Asian continent," his second-in-command Taranth reported. His voice was completely flat, drained of all emotion. He had become a machine that just recited facts, too exhausted to feel anything at all. 500 soldiers, gone. The humans used some kind of chemical agent that dissolved right through their armor. What kind of chemical? Varithk demanded. Our science teams are still analyzing it, Torinth replied. It appears to be based on fluorine compounds. It's incredibly corrosive, and it seems specifically engineered to react with the alloys in our body armor. How are they inventing new weapons so quickly? Varithk whispered to himself. Torinth had no answer. No one did. The simple truth was, the Varith had never encountered a species like humanity. Every other race they had conquered fought in a predictable pattern. They had organized armies with clear leaders you could take out. Their weapons were developed in government labs. They used standard military tactics. But humans? Humans threw the entire rulebook out the window. In every ruined city, in every small town, in every hidden refugee camp, people were innovating. Scientists who had never met were independently solving the same problems and creating dozens of different, deadly solutions. Soldiers were taking their own guns apart on the battlefield, cobbling together new weapons from scrap metal and captured alien tech. Teenagers were literally building bombs in their basements. It was total chaos. It was complete insanity, and it was terrifyingly effective. An engineer hiding out in Buenos Aires discovered a weakness in the Varith shield generators. Within hours, that information was shared across the globe through a secret web of communication channels. By the next day, every human resistance fighter knew exactly how to bypass their shields. A chemist in Mumbai created a compound that could melt Varith armor like it was plastic. A few days later, makeshift factories across India were churning it out and shipping it to front lines all over the world. A kid in Seoul figured out how to hack their communication frequencies. All of a sudden, human commanders could listen in on every single order the aliens gave each other. The Varith had conquered 2,000 planets. On every one of those worlds, they had faced a traditional military force. Take out the leadership, and the army would collapse. But humanity didn't have a single leader. They were a hydra. You cut off one head, and 10 more would grow back in its place. You flattened one city, and 100 small towns would rise up to take on the fight. They are learning faster than we can possibly adapt, Torinth said, his voice grim. Our strategies become obsolete in a matter of hours. They're developing counters to our weapons almost as fast as we can deploy them. I have never seen anything like this. Then we have to do something they can't counter, Varithk snarled. Something final. So what are you getting at? Torinth asked. Varithk wheeled around to face his top science officer. Tell me, how long would it take us to crack this planet's crust? I want to trigger enough geological chaos to make the surface a completely unlivable hellscape. The science officer went pale, looking like he'd seen a ghost. High Commander, that would sterilize the entire world. It would be decades before the surface was stable again. We'd get nothing but a dead rock. Right now, Varithk snapped, I'd prefer a dead rock over this nightmare. How long? It would take roughly 2 days of non-stop concentrated orbital fire. We'd have to aim for the major tectonic fault lines. Then get it done, Varithk commanded. Torinth stepped forward. High Commander, I must object. The Dominion Council sent us here to conquer this planet, not to vaporize it. If we go back home with a pile of dust, they'll have our heads, Torinth argued. If we don't go back at all, Varithk shot back, we won't have to worry about that, will we? He turned to look his second-in-command dead in the eye. We are losing, Torinth. I see it. You see it. Every last officer in this fleet sees it. We can't win this world with a ground war, so we either crack it open like an egg, or we turn tail and admit that a bunch of primitives beat us. Then maybe we should pull back, Torinth insisted. We can go back and tell the Council that a species of primitives drove us off. That 9,000 of our best warships weren't enough to take one tiny, insignificant planet. Varithk just shook his head. No, I would rather die right here, right now, than live with that kind of shame. My decision is final. Start the bombardment. Torinth just stared at his commander for a long, heavy moment. He spotted something in Varithk's eyes he'd never seen in all their years together. It wasn't just exhaustion or rage. It was something deeper. Something utterly broken. Vorith had been a conqueror for 300 years. His entire life, his very identity, was built on an unbroken chain of victories. The idea that he could actually fail was a poison, eating him alive from the inside. At last, Torrent gave a slow, pained nod. "As you command, High Commander." He turned to pass along the order, knowing full well it was a death sentence for every living thing on the world below. Billions of human beings, most of them just regular people, were about to be wiped out for the simple crime of not giving up. But Torrent was a soldier, and soldiers have to follow orders. Or at least, that's what he had always told himself. Down on Earth, human intelligence picked up the Vareth communications almost instantly. Turns out, that teenage hacker over in Seoul had done his job a lot better than anyone had ever guessed. The report hit President Shen's desk in minutes. She listened to the translated audio of Vorith's command, and she felt the blood in her veins turn to ice. "They're going to shatter the planet," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They know they can't win, so they're just going to murder us all." "Madam President, we have to do something," General Stone insisted. "We can't stop that kind of orbital bombardment. Our weapons can't even reach their fleet, and we don't have a single ship left in space." "I know that, General," she replied. "So what's the play?" Shen was silent for a very long time. She thought about her sister, who had died in the cold emptiness of space during the very first attack. She thought about the millions of soldiers and civilians who had already given their lives. She thought about every single sacrifice humanity had made just to stay in the fight. And in that moment, her mind was made up. "General, how many of our special assault teams are still in fighting condition?" "We have about a dozen units still capable of offensive operations," he answered. "Most are spread thin across the planet, fighting a guerrilla war." "Get them back," she commanded. "Pull every single one of them. I've got a new target for them." "What kind of target?" Stone asked. Shen looked up at the tactical map, at the angry red swarm of enemy ships hanging over them. Thousands of them. Any single one of those ships could wipe a city off the face of the earth. It was an impossible target for any conventional attack. But humanity had thrown the rulebook out a long time ago. "We're going to board their flagship," she announced, her voice filled with icy determination. "We're going to take out their commander, and we are going to show them that no matter how far they run or how high they fly, we will hunt them down, and we will make them pay." Stone just gaped at her. "That's a suicide mission. We don't have ships that can get our people up there." "We have their ships," she shot back. "Every team that's been fighting on the ground has captured Vareth equipment, Vareth vehicles. Some of them have even managed to grab a few of their shuttles." "Stolen shuttles using stolen codes," Stone argued. "The enemy will see them coming a mile away. Not if we launch the biggest, loudest, most insane distraction in the history of warfare at the exact same moment," she explained. "Something so huge they'll be too busy dealing with it to notice a few little shuttles slipping through the chaos." Stone mulled it over. The plan was nuts. It was beyond a Hail Mary. It was the kind of long shot that had absolutely no right to ever work. In other words, it was a perfectly human plan. "What kind of an attack are we talking about?" he asked. "Everything," she said. "Everything we have left. Every missile, every gun, every last plane that can still get off the ground. We throw it all at them in one giant wave. And while they're weathering that storm, our teams sneak in and hit the flagship." "And what if the teams fail?" Stone asked quietly. "Then we all die anyway," she said, her expression grim. "But at least this way, we die swinging." Stone gave a slow, resolute nod. "I'll start making the calls." "Do it now," she replied. "The clock is ticking." While the president was putting her impossible plan into motion, another was already taking shape on the ground. In the bombed-out ruins of what used to be Chicago, a group of 50 soldiers was gearing up for a mission they knew they probably weren't coming back from. They were the Hellhounds, one of the most elite special ops units in the entire American military. They'd been bleeding the Vareth dry from day one, ambushing their patrols and blowing up their supply lines. Now, they had a new assignment. Get on the enemy flagship, kill the commander, and save the entire world. Simple, right? Their leader was Sergeant Maria Santos. She was 32 years old, with dark hair and eyes that had seen way too much. The invasion's first attack had wiped her entire family from existence. Her parents, her brother, her sister, her husband, and her two small children, all of them vaporized in a single blinding flash of light. She had absolutely nothing left to live for, which meant she had everything to die for. "All right, listen up, people," she said to her team, her voice steady as a rock. "This is it. We get one shot. We have one shuttle, one chance to get on that ship, and one shot at their high commander. If we mess this up, humanity is finished. But if we pull this off, we might just buy everyone back home enough time to actually win this thing." "Sarge, how are we supposed to get past their security?" a young soldier asked, his voice shaking just a little. "That ship has a crew of 10,000. Even if we get on board, we'll be outnumbered 200 to 1. "We don't have to fight 10,000, she replied. "We just have to make it to the bridge. Intel says the Vareth command is all run from one spot. We take out their commander, and their whole fleet descends into chaos. Then we blow the ship's reactor and take as many of those monsters down with us as we possibly can." The soldier who was listening just nodded. He couldn't have been more than 20, a kid who was still in basic training when the aliens arrived, but his eyes were like flint and his hands were perfectly steady. This war had aged him beyond his years. "Let's do this," he said. Sergeant Santos looked over her team. 50 soldiers, every last one a volunteer, and every single one of them knew this was a one-way trip. They were a mix from every branch of the military, from every walk of life, men, women, grizzled old veterans, and fresh-faced rookies. The only thing they had in common was the willingness to give up everything to save their world. "The shuttle lifts off in 1 hour," Santos announced. "Get your gear, say your prayers, write your letters home. Because when we get up there, I want you to remember who we're fighting for. Remember every person we've lost, and make the bastards pay." The hour disappeared in what felt like a second. It was over way too fast. Before she knew it, Santos was strapped into a stolen enemy shuttle, watching Earth get smaller and smaller below her. The ship soared up through the atmosphere, broadcasting stolen security codes to any enemy vessel that challenged it. So far, the codes were holding up. The Vareth were too busy with the massive attack President Shen had unleashed to pay any mind to one tiny shuttle. Through the viewport, Santos watched the battle unfold. Thousands of missiles climbed from Earth like a swarm of angry fireflies, all streaking toward the enemy fleet. Squadrons of fighter jets flew on suicide runs, their pilots knowing they had zero chance but attacking with everything they had anyway. It was the most beautiful and the most horrifying thing she had ever laid eyes on. As they got close to the flagship, the pilot's voice crackled over the comms. "They're hailing us." "Use the codes," Santos ordered. "I am. They're buying it. They're telling us to head to a landing bay on the port side. Take us in." The shuttle slipped into the landing bay of the Eternal Conquest without a single problem. Santos waited for the massive bay doors to grind shut behind them before she gave her command. "Go, fast and silent. Take down anyone you see." The hellhounds poured out of the shuttle like demons from a cage, moving through the ship's corridors with terrifying speed and precision. Imagine watching your world burn from an enemy you can't even touch. For 6 straight days, that's what we did. They called us primitives, insects. But they made one fatal mistake. They pushed us too far. And that's why right now, a handful of ghosts armed with the enemy's own weapons are creeping through the heart of their flagship. You're about to see what happens when the prey learns to bite back. A muffled shot, the hiss of a blade, the sickening crack of a neck in the shadows. That was their calling card. The Vareth soldiers dropped without a sound, completely ambushed from within their own fortress. They were so focused on the human ships pounding uselessly against their shields outside, They never dreamed we were already inside the house. By the time the first real alarm started screaming, Sergeant Santos and her team were already closing in on the bridge. "Got contacts, dead ahead," a scout breathed over the comms. "Security checkpoint. Looks like 20 guards." "Grenades!" Santos ordered, her voice ice cold. "On my mark!" In perfect, deadly silence, every soldier pulled a pin. The world exploded in a blinding flash of light and metal, wiping out most of the guards in a single, brutal second. The few who were left standing were cut down before they could even scream. This team, nicknamed the Hellhounds, moved on, leaving only silence and destruction in their wake. Meanwhile, up on the bridge of the warship Eternal Conquest, High Commander Vorthkul wasn't even looking at the chaos erupting inside his own ship. He was completely captivated by the space battle on the main view screen. "Their attack is a pathetic failure," he gloated to his second-in-command. "Our shields are invincible. Their pathetic weapons can't even scratch the paint." "Indeed, High Commander," Torrent agreed, though his tone was cautious. "But we are losing some escort ships. They're targeting our weak points with unsettling precision." Vorthkul just waved him off. "Inconsequential. As long as this flagship remains, the fleet is ours. Continue preparing the planetary bombardment." "High Commander, I'm getting reports of weapons fire inside the ship. None of our security teams are responding." Vorthkul finally dragged his eyes away from the pretty lights of the battle. "What did you say?" "It seems humans have boarded the ship, sir. They're fighting their way to the bridge." For a moment, the words just didn't compute. Humans? On his ship? Impossible. No transport could have slipped through their blockade. But then he remembered the absolute chaos of the battle, the thousands of false signals jamming their sensors, the overwhelming assault that had every single one of his crew members looking out, not in. It was all a giant magic trick. The entire massive space battle was nothing but a diversion to sneak a few soldiers on board. "How many of them?" he snarled. "We don't know for sure. Initial reports suggest fewer than 100. 100 soldiers against 10,000? Vorthkul actually laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "They're insane. Deploy every security team we have. I want their heads on pikes." But the Hellhounds weren't sticking around to be cornered. They were moving with a terrifying speed that the Vareth couldn't match. Every second that ticked by brought them closer to their target. Santos was at the very front of the charge. She'd already lost 10 soldiers getting this far, and 10 more were wounded. But they were almost there. She could see the massive bridge doors just down the hall. They were like fortress gates made of reinforced metal. "Explosives!" she shouted. "Give it everything you've got!" Her demolition expert slapped charges onto the door while the rest of the team formed a desperate firing line, holding back the Varath security forces that were finally swarming them. The corridor behind them became a meat grinder, bodies piling up as the humans refused to give an inch of ground. "Charges are set. Everybody back." The explosion was deafening, blowing the huge doors completely off their hinges. Before the twisted metal even hit the floor, Santos was already diving through the smoke, her rifle spitting fire at anything that moved. The bridge was absolute chaos. Officers fumbled for their sidearms, guards scrambled to form a defensive line. And there, standing in the middle of it all, silhouetted against the view screen showing her burning world, was the alien who gave the order. Vorthkul. Santos didn't waste a second. She raised her rifle and fired. The round slammed into Vorthkul's chest, throwing him back a step. But the Vareth were built tough. They could shrug off hits that would kill a human 10 times over. He was still standing, reaching for his own weapon. Santos fired again, and again, and again. Each shot hammered Vorthkul backward, green blood splattering across his pristine command deck. His 4 eyes were wide with disbelief. This wasn't possible. He was a conqueror of galaxies. He couldn't die here, at the hands of these primitives. But he was dying. He could feel his life slipping away. "You," he choked out. "You're just animals." Santos strode right up to him, ignoring her own wounds. She was covered in cuts and burns, but her eyes were like chips of diamond and her hands were perfectly steady. "We're humans," she said, her voice dangerously calm. "And we don't know how to surrender." She pressed the barrel of her rifle to his forehead and pulled the trigger. High Commander Vorthkul, vanquisher of 2,000 worlds, died on the bridge of his own flagship, murdered by a species he hadn't even considered a threat. Santos had no time to savor the moment. More Vareth were storming the bridge. She glanced at her surviving soldiers. Only 6 left, just 6. "Plant charges on the main reactor," she commanded. "Use every last one." "Sergeant, if we blow the reactor this close to the planet—" "I know," she said, a sad, determined smile on her face. "This was always a one-way trip. Let's make it count." The explosives were set. The timer started its final countdown. Santos found a security camera, its red light blinking, and stared directly into it. She knew that somewhere, on the world she was saving, her people were watching. "Tell the president we got him," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Tell her the hellhounds send their regards." She snapped her hand up in one last perfect salute. The reactor went critical. The eternal conquest was torn apart from the inside out. The explosion vaporized the bridge, the corridors, and every deck in a wave of pure energy. It rippled outward, a tidal wave of fire that consumed everything it touched. Secondary explosions erupted as munitions and fuel lines cooked off, turning the warship into a chain of brilliant, deadly fireworks. The flagship shattered into a million burning pieces, and when the light finally faded, there was nothing left but a silent cloud of cosmic dust. In orbit, high above Earth, the Vareth fleet was suddenly a headless snake. Ships that had moved with one mind now drifted aimlessly. Captains who had followed orders without question now had no one to give them. The perfect chain of command had been broken. Down on Earth, President Chen watched the enemy flagship die on a tactical display. She watched the incredible sacrifice of her soldiers pay off, and for the first time in a week, she allowed a fragile sliver of hope to bloom in her chest. The war was a long way from over, but for the first time, she believed humanity might actually survive it. "God bless you, Sergeant Santos," she whispered to the screen. "God bless every single one of you." And somewhere in the fiery ghost of the eternal conquest, Maria Santos smiled one last time before the fire took her home. She had won. Humanity would live. The death of High Commander Vorthkul shattered everything. For 6 days, the Vareth fleet had operated like a single organism, guided by a single ruthless will. Every ship knew its mission. Every captain obeyed without hesitation. Their command structure was supposed to be flawless, unbreakable. But now, it was in pieces. The new acting commander, Torrent, stood on the emergency bridge of his cruiser, the Blade of Justice. He'd been coordinating the orbital bombardment when the eternal conquest had simply vanished from his screen. Now, he was the highest-ranking officer left. "Give me the damage report," he asked. His voice was a hollow echo of itself. "The flagship and 93 escort vessels were destroyed in the blast," a tactical officer reported, his voice shaking. "High Commander Vorthkul is confirmed gone, along with the entire command staff." "What's our remaining fleet strength?" "Roughly 6,800 ships, Commander. We began the invasion with 9,900. Torrent squeezed his eyes shut. Over 3,000 ships gone, millions of soldiers dead, and for what? They hadn't even managed to take half the planet. The humans still held their major cities, still controlled their resources. Every single time the Vareth thought they had them cornered, the humans found some new, impossible way to strike back. And now this. A tiny squad of soldiers, 50 at the most, had managed to board the most heavily defended ship in the fleet and assassinate the High Commander. In his 200 years of life, after crushing dozens of star systems in countless wars, Commander Torrent had never seen anything like it. The humans had died, yes, but in dying, they had scored the biggest victory. He was supposed to be a conqueror. Right now, he just felt like the survivor of a slaughter. How could a species this primitive push a galactic empire to the very edge? You're about to find out. "Commander," his tactical officer's voice trembled, "what are your orders?" Torrance stood in silence, haunted by his predecessor's last command, an order to crack the planet's crust. He thought of the Dominion Council, so sure of another easy conquest. He thought of his own soldiers, still fighting and dying down on that world. And he thought about the humans. He had studied them, watched them, and he had seen a fire that defied all military logic. He witnessed soldiers grinning as they charged headfirst into plasma fire that would instantly turn them to ash. He saw civilians in regular clothes launching chunks of rubble at his state-of-the-art war machines. He saw kids, actual children, strapping explosives to themselves just to eliminate a single enemy squad. This was an entire species that didn't see death as a loss, but as one last brutal weapon to throw at their enemies. They weren't fighting for victory. They were fighting to make the Vath bleed for every single inch of territory. For them, every ship the Vath lost, every soldier who died, that was a win. They would fight until the very last human heart gave out, and even then, Torrance had a gut-wrenching feeling they'd figure out a way to keep fighting. "Commander?" The tactical officer's voice cut through his thoughts. Torrance's eyes snapped back to the bridge. "Signal the fleet," he commanded, his voice devoid of emotion. "We're leaving." A wave of shocked silence washed over the bridge. Every officer whipped around to face him, their expressions a perfect picture of disbelief. "Sir, did you just give the order to retreat?" "I did," Torrance replied flatly. "This is a war we cannot win. Every day we stay here, we lose more ships, more soldiers. These humans have weapons that shouldn't be possible, tactics we can't anticipate, and a will to fight that is frankly terrifying. If we stay, this planet will become our graveyard." "But the Council," another officer began to protest. "The Council isn't here," Torrance roared. "They aren't the ones watching our soldiers get slaughtered by the thousands. They're not the ones seeing our starships torn to pieces by impossible technology. I am in command, and I say we are done." He locked his eyes on the communications officer. "Send my orders to every ship in the fleet. All vessels will cease hostile action and prepare for an immediate jump to hyperspace. All ground forces are to return to their transports, effective immediately. We are out of here in 2 hours." "Yes, Commander." The order flew across the system. On the bridges of 1,000 ships, captains and crews reacted with a mixture of shock and profound relief. Some were just thankful to be escaping the meat grinder. Others felt a hot surge of anger, seeing the retreat as a betrayal of every fallen comrade. But every single one of them followed the order without question. Torrance was in charge, and his command was absolute. Down on the planet, the massive Vath war machine sputtered to a halt and began its slow, humiliating withdrawal. Soldiers who had only ever known how to advance were now ordered back to their landing craft. Tanks that had been leveling cities now turned around and rumbled back the way they came. The humans watched them pull back, their suspicion thick enough to taste. Could this be some kind of trap? A new, devious strategy? Miles below the surface in her command bunker, President Chen stared at the incoming data, unable to process it. "They're really leaving?" she asked, her voice a hoarse whisper. "Just walking away?" "It appears so, Madam President," General Stone replied, his own voice tight with disbelief. "Our satellites confirm their fleet is pulling back past the moon. They're arranging themselves into what looks like a jump formation." "But why would they stop now?" Chen demanded. "They still have thousands of ships. They could have bombarded us from orbit, cracked this planet in half like they said they would." "I believe Sergeant Santos's mission changed their minds, ma'am. She did more than just take out their high commander. She broke their spirit." Chen let that sink in. The Vath had never experienced defeat. They had never met a species that could punch back so hard. The assassination of their supreme leader by a small team on a suicide mission must have struck fear into their hearts. If a handful of determined humans could pull that off, what else could they do? The Vath weren't running because they were beaten. They were running because they were scared. "Keep tracking them," Chen ordered, her voice hardening into steel. "I want to be 100% sure they're gone. And if they so much as look back, I want you to hit them with every last round we have." Yes, Madam President. In orbit, Torrance watched his broken fleet limp into formation. Ships poured in from all over the system, trying to create the vast, precise pattern needed for a group jump. The withdrawal was going about as well as he could hope, but the reports from the ground were getting uglier by the minute. "Commander, our ground units are taking heavy fire," an operations officer called out. "The humans aren't just letting them walk away." "Tell them to fight their way out," Torrance ordered through clenched teeth. "We are not leaving anyone behind." "Sir, that's going to cost us more lives." "I'm aware," Torrance said softly. "Give the order." Of course the humans wouldn't make it simple. Even in victory, they were going to squeeze every last drop of blood from the invaders. Torrance felt a strange, bitter respect for them, even as he hated them for what they'd forced him to do. These were not primitive creatures. These were warriors. As the agonizing hours crawled by, the fleet got smaller and smaller. Ships that were too damaged to make the jump were simply abandoned. Soldiers who couldn't reach a transport were left to their fate. It was a cold, brutal calculation, but it had to be done. Once the fleet was finally in position, Torrance asked for the final count. "Fleet strength is at approximately 4,200 vessels," the tactical officer reported, his voice hollow. "We've managed to pull out about 1.5 million ground troops." 4,000 ships. They had shown up with nearly 10,000. More than half the fleet was gone, either destroyed or left drifting in space as silent tombs. "And our losses?" Torrance asked. "It's difficult to get an exact number, Commander, but initial estimates put it around 3 million dead, and that includes High Commander Varathk and his entire command staff." 3 million. All lost on a planet they thought they'd conquer in a single afternoon. Torrance gave a slow, heavy nod. "Initiate the hyperspace jump." "Yes, Commander." All across the formation, massive engines began to whine as energy fields formed around each ship, getting ready to tear a hole in reality. And in that moment, the humans unleashed absolute hell. They came from everywhere at once. Missiles, hidden among the battlefield debris, roared to life. Drones that had been playing dead suddenly lit up. Weapon systems on the moon that had gone dark for days fired their final salvos at this one. Perfect opportunity. The Vath had to lower their shields to jump. They were completely defenseless. Ships simply began to disappear. Railgun slugs, traveling at a percentage of light speed, ripped through their hulls like tissue paper. Missiles slammed into engine cores, turning warships into miniature suns. Plasma cannons swept across the formations, and vessels melted into glowing slag. "All ships, emergency jump!" Torrance screamed. "Jump now! Get out!" The fleet scrambled. Portals to hyperspace like shimmering purple wounds tore open in the blackness. Ships dove toward them, desperate to escape the massacre. But the humans had one last trick up their sleeve. Gravitational mines, planted near the jump point, suddenly came online. They warped the space around them, making the hyperspace portals unstable. The ships that jumped through weren't escaping. They were being annihilated. Their crews died screaming as their vessels were simultaneously stretched into spaghetti and crushed into atoms by the warring laws of physics. Torrance could only watch in sheer horror as his fleet was methodically erased from existence around him. Ships he'd served on for centuries, crews he'd known his whole life, all of them snuffed out in an instant. "Recalculate our jump coordinates," he yelled. "Find a clear path out of this nightmare." "I'm trying, Commander. These distortions are making it nearly impossible." More ships blew apart. The humans were using everything they had left. This was their final, hateful goodbye, and it was brutally effective. The flagship, the Blade of Justice, shuddered as a railgun slug glanced off its shields. Torrance dug his fingers into the arms of his command chair, fighting to hide the sheer terror he felt. "Status report!" "I've got one. Jump coordinates locked. We have a clean exit, but it's a tight window. We're going to lose more ships on the way there." "Do it," he ordered. "All ships on my mark." The Blade of Justice rocketed toward the new jump point, with the tattered remains of the fleet struggling to keep up. Behind them, the humans just kept shooting, kept killing. The portal grew closer. Torrance watched the tactical display, his heart sinking as the number of friendly ships continued to drop. 3,000, 2,000, 1,000. The blade of justice plunged through the portal, and the universe became a tunnel of violet light, leaving the slaughter behind. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Torrance allowed himself to breathe. How many got out?" he asked, almost terrified to hear the answer. The tactical officer stared at his console, his face pale as a ghost. 17, Commander," he whispered. 17 ships made it. 17. Out of 9,900, Torrance collapsed back into his command chair, utterly silent. There was nothing left to say. The invasion of Earth was over. The Vath had lost. The journey back to their home space took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of complete silence, of mourning, and of trying to comprehend the impossible. Torrance spent most of that time locked in his quarters, writing his report for the Dominion Council, the most difficult words he would ever have to write. He wrote about human technology that defied all logic. He'd written about their uncanny strategies, their ability to innovate and adapt quicker than any species he had ever documented. He detailed their raw determination, their stubborn refusal to break even when facing complete annihilation. And then he wrote his final, chilling recommendation. When the 17 surviving vessels limped back to the Dominion capital, a fleet of immaculate escorts met them, guiding them straight to the council chambers. Torrance soon found himself standing before the assembled masters of the Dominion, the most powerful beings across 3 galaxies. Their eyes burned into him with undisguised fury and contempt. In their minds, he was a disgrace, a coward who had run from a fight. He had brought shame upon the Dominion. "Justify your actions, Commander," the High Counselor hissed. "How did you lose an entire invasion fleet to a planet of backwater savages?" Torrance stood his ground. "Have you ever imagined sending 10,000 of your most powerful battleships to claim what should be an easy prize? A primitive, isolated world? Now picture this. Only 17 of those ships crawl back home, scarred and broken. That was the nightmare Commander Torrance had been reliving for 3 weeks, and he knew that telling the Dominion Council what really happened might be the last thing he ever did, but he had to try. "They are not primitive," he started, his voice firm despite the shaking of his hands. "They just appear that way because they haven't reached for the stars, but their technology evolves at a frightening pace. Their tactics are ingenious, and their will to fight, it's an inferno we've never encountered. You gave me 10,000 warships. They tore our fleet apart. We eliminated millions of their population, and it only made them angrier. We melted their cities into glass, and they fought on. We bombarded their world from orbit, and they just kept coming. They do not surrender. They don't have a word for it. They fight until they win, or until not a single one of them is left breathing." The council chamber was deathly quiet until one member sneered. "Then we'll simply dispatch a larger fleet, 20,000 ships, 30,000, whatever it takes to get the job done." Torrance just slowly shook his head, a gesture heavy with the weight of 200 years of warfare. "It won't change a thing. You could send every last ship in our armada, and it would still fall short. By the time that force arrived, the humans would have deployed new weapons, new strategies. They will have analyzed every mistake we made. They will be exponentially stronger." He met the gaze of each council member, one after another. "I have waged war for 2 centuries. I've brought worlds to their knees that would make the Vath look like children playing in a sandbox. But I have never, ever encountered an enemy like the humans. They aren't like us. They aren't like any race we've ever cataloged. There's something else entirely, something truly terrifying." The High Counselor leaned in, his voice low. "So what is your recommendation, Commander?" Torrance drew a long, heavy breath. "Stay away from them. At any and all costs. Do not engage them again. Do not give them any reason to look our way. If we can pull it off, we should erase any evidence that we even exist. Leave their planet and pray to whatever gods you believe in that they never get the idea to come looking for us." The chamber erupted in chaos. Council members shot to their feet, screaming, calling him a coward and a traitor. Torrance stood unflinching. "I'm telling you the unvarnished truth," he declared over the uproar. "You can execute me for saying it, but that won't alter the facts. We assaulted their world, a planet they call Earth, with 9,900 state-of-the-art warships. 17 returned. 17. That is the cold, hard reality you must accept." With a sharp wave of his hand, the High Counselor demanded silence. "You genuinely believe they are that much of a threat?" Torrance's stare was like granite. "I believe they are the single greatest threat our civilization has ever known. And it has nothing to do with their technology or their ships," he went on. "It's about what they are. They are survivors. They adapt. They learn. They endure punishment that would shatter any other species, and they just get back on their feet, stronger than before. They simply do not give up." His thoughts flashed back to the pandemonium on his flagship's bridge. He saw the face of a human soldier, a woman who had somehow boarded their vessel, and she was smiling as she single-handedly took down the High Commander. "If we return, we will all perish. That is not a prediction. It is a certainty." The council debated for hours, but in the end, terror carried the vote. Humanity was officially designated a forbidden species. Their homeworld was flagged in the Dominion archives with the maximum possible threat rating. A permanent directive was issued. All ships were to maintain a minimum 10 light-year buffer from their solar system. As for Torrance, he was sentenced to a life of exile for his monumental failure. He accepted the judgment without a word of protest. He had saved the lives of his remaining crews. He had delivered the warning. It was the most he could do. As he boarded the transport that would take him to a forgotten moon, he glanced back at the star maps. Out there, circling a small yellow sun, the humans were probably already rebuilding, learning, and growing more powerful. He had told the Council they were the most dangerous species in the galaxy. But that wasn't the complete truth. He hadn't told them about the look in that human sergeant's eyes right before she finished High Commander Varul. It wasn't hatred or fury or even fear. It was something else entirely. Something Torrance had only witnessed in the eyes of his own people's most legendary heroes. It was pure, unfiltered joy. The humans didn't just fight to stay alive. They didn't just fight to defend their homes. They fought because they were born for it. Conflict was in their blood, in their very bones, woven into the deepest parts of their spirit. And now, thanks to the Dominion's blunder, they knew they weren't alone in the cosmos. They knew the galaxy was brimming with new sights to see, new mountains to climb, and new adversaries to overcome. Torrance stared out into the blackness and felt a profound chill. The Dominion leadership actually believed their quarantine would hold. They thought by redlining Earth's star system, they could guarantee their own safety. What fools! The humans were never going to stay put. They would build bigger ships, better ships. And one day, they would go exploring in the darkness between the stars. It was only a matter of time before they stumbled upon the Dominion. And when that day came, the fact that 17 ships managed to escape would be remembered as an unbelievable miracle. 40 years later, Torrance's unspoken prophecy came to pass. Human vessels appeared at the edge of Dominion territory. They didn't look like warships, at least not at first glance. They arrived with their weapons ports sealed and their communication lines wide open, broadcasting messages of peace and a desire for trade. But everyone who saw them knew the legends. Everyone knew what had happened at Earth. The humans were received with a cocktail of terror and reverence. They were given anything they wanted: trade agreements, diplomatic outposts, access to any market or technology. Nobody was brave enough to refuse. And when the first human diplomats strolled through the halls of the Dominion Council, the few members old enough to recall Torrance's warning looked upon them with absolute dread. These were the beings who had wiped a fleet of nearly 10,000 warships from existence. These were the people who had charged headfirst into plasma cannons, armed with little more than primitive slug throwers and sharpened pieces of metal. These were the creatures who had smiled as they fell, knowing their sacrifice would pave the way to victory. Humanity had won something far more precious than treaties or commercial goods. They had earned it with fire and blood. They had earned respect born from fear. And in a galaxy teeming with predators, fear was the most valuable currency of all. One of the human ambassadors, a young woman by the name of Elena Santos, paused before the enormous memorial the Dominion had erected for its lost fleet. The wall was a titanic structure, etched with the name of every last soldier and ship lost during the invasion of Earth. She scanned the names for a long while before turning to the Dominion official at her side. "My grandmother was a soldier in that war," she remarked, her tone light and casual. "She was the one who led the strike team that took out your high commander." The official's face drained of all color. I'm profoundly sorry for your family's loss." Elena simply smiled. "Oh, don't be. She went out exactly the way she always wanted to, fighting and winning." It was the same bone-chilling smile her grandmother had worn on the bridge of Torrance flagship just before the end. "We remember her as a hero," Elena said. "One of the brave souls who saved our entire species. I'm sure you remember her as something different." "We remember her as a warning," the official confessed, his voice barely a whisper. "Excellent." Elena's smile grew a fraction wider. That's precisely what she would have wanted. She turned and walked on, leaving the official frozen in place before the monument. He watched her depart, that old familiar dread creeping back into his soul. The humans were here. They were smiling, they were making deals, they were signing pacts. But everyone knew what lay beneath the surface. Underneath all the diplomacy, they were the same terrifying force of nature from the stories. The galaxy would never, ever forget the day that 9,900 warships descended upon a small blue planet, and only 17 escaped to carry the tale. That tale became a legend, the legend became a myth, and the myth became a fundamental piece of galactic wisdom. Do not provoke the humans. Do not threaten their home, and never, ever mistake their politeness for weakness. Because when humans are finally backed into a corner, they don't stop fighting. They never stop. And in the end, they always find a way to win. That is the legacy of Earth. That is the legacy of humanity. And that is why the galaxy learned to live in fear of a small, quiet world orbiting a very ordinary yellow star. And it's why, to this very day, no one has ever been foolish enough to try invading Earth again.